Now, everything that we need to know about this style is basically baked into here, with maybe a few twists later on, of course, in later eras of stride. The first thing, of course, I'd like to call your attention to, this music is actually in 2/4, which is quite interesting, which is more in a marching band fashion. 2/4 was the beat, essentially, for marching. So everything's expressed in 16th notes and 8th notes, rather than we're used to seeing more quarter notes and 8th notes in more modern jazz. So just something kind of notable there. I'm actually going to put this on screen in a little bit smaller format for us here. First, looking at the left hand, we have an intro. And if we kind of zoom in here on the left hand, we'll see the texture is pretty light. It's a lot of single notes or octaves and then a chord. That's essentially the essence of stride piano, is a bass note and then a chord, and then the bass note and a chord. So just looking at the first 4 bars here, we have now he switches it up at the end. We go bass, chord, chord, chord. But that's essentially it. Now, coming from the brass band music that this was really influenced by, those downbeats on beats 1 and 2, or later on in 4/4 stride, those are essentially trombone lines from what I understand. And so those can be a little bit more legato, and the top notes can be a little bit more staccato. Right, because you're mimicking this sort of smooth trombone line. If we only play the downbeats, we'll actually hear that it's a very nice and very cohesive line. So we go C, G, F, E, G, C. And so as you're checking out this sort of proto stride, I would encourage you to look at just what are the downbeats, because you're always making a melody no matter what you're doing. And this is something that Noah talks about a lot. Let's also look at the melody of the chords that happen on the offbeats or the weak beats. Right? Essentially thinking of our voices, our voice leading or our choir. We have sometimes a 3-note texture, sometimes a 2-note texture. As we get into more and more advanced stride playing, it gets fatter intervals, and we'll see some of these bigger things that we can do in the left hand here. And depending on our hand size, of course, it can vary how we sort of approach that. But from a left hand perspective, we have what's called the boom chick. Boom, boom, chick, boom, chick, boom, chick, boom, chick, right? And so that is going to persist throughout stride. Now, of course, he switches it up. He has, at the end of the measure, goes boom, chick, 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 right? So a little bit of variety, right? We want to set up expectations. This is something I always tell myself musically. We want to set up expectations for long enough. Set up an expectation long enough that we know what you're doing, and then defy it with, going outside of the expectation. So we can see that, and, some of my other students are probably nodding along. Really, really big on that. Setting up an expectation. So we've set up certain expectations.
Hey, Noah here. Just want to let you know really quick that most of the content you're actually seeing on this channel is coming from completely free masterclasses that we've been holding. So if you actually want to join and be a part of those masterclasses, again, it's totally free. Click one of the links in the description that will give you access to free resources, free courses, and of course the free masterclasses. And as soon as you're on the email list, you will be one of the first people to know when we are holding these masterclasses. And on top of that, you get lots of free sheet music and videos and resources as well. So highly recommend you sign up. You can also join our free online community, which is in Discord, in a server there, so you can click the link down there for that as well. And we are on there interacting, hanging out, giving people feedback and advice, as well as on the free masterclasses, Zoom hangs, and feedback sessions. So again, highly recommend you get signed up, and I will see you there.
Let's continue on, and let's see another facet of the left hand, which is going to persist in all sorts of stride influenced music. I would call this proto stride. This is more ragtime, of course, if you're familiar with that term. Another way that he switches it up is, sometimes he'll have a single note texture or an octave. We see that in this measure here, a root and then an octave, and back to another octave chord. Now we have our first instance of walking octaves. Secondary dominant, right? D7 going outside the key of C just briefly here. So that would be our first instance of a couple of things. There's a little bit more chromaticism, right? E flat is not in the key of C. And we're just kind of walking it from this target. We're walking, again, if we look only at the bass notes, the downbeats of beat 1 and beat 2 in this case, C, G, F. Now let's look at both of these, E, E flat, D. So those trombone lines are really, really smooth. Right? There is such a good melody happening. So that's one of the things as we get more and more into this. I mean, you're really dealing with voice leading, or if you want to take it back to the idea of giving everybody a very singable, interesting part, the voices move very smooth, G, F, E, E flat, down to D. So that walking octave aspect is going to be super, super important as we get further and further into more advanced or more modern. This is quite advanced actually, but more modern stride playing. And then at the end here, of course, we have another instance of walking octaves, getting us in the last measure here, chord, right? And it walks us back up to the note C. Kind of interesting too to go from an octave texture here to a single note texture there. Again, the texture here is pretty light. There's not a lot of sevenths or fifths or anything in the bass notes or the bass intervals. It's more octaves or single notes. Real quickly too, let's take a look at the right hand. Not necessarily as much of a focus for stride piano. The left hand is such a strong identifying factor. However, just a couple of quick notes about the right hand. We have some syncopation here for sure. Right? This is one of the big, big innovations of this music, was taking melodies that were perhaps classically or, brass band music influenced and syncopating them. If we played this in a more strict, non-syncopated fashion, it might be something like, right? It robs so much of the soul and the character out of it. So this syncopation, ba-da, 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 that is a huge, huge element. The syncopated element in the right hand, as we see later, is going to be huge. Also, very important, is this line here. What we have there is essentially an octave line with an interval in the middle. So the interval in the middle gives a little bit fuller sound. This is probably one of the most full expressions of music on the piano. It's very orchestral. We're really thinking we've got our trombone lines, going in the left hand. And we have our, chick, that's another instrument. And then we have, yet another instrument up here. And the interval of a third really added in there, the third of each chord, or each sort of octave, really lends a sweeter sound. The octaves by themselves are a little bit more hollow versus with the interval. So, a couple of exercises that will help you here. So let's look at a quick example. Noah has a great video, at least one that I've seen, about this. But a really great starting point is to, and I'll get rid of this guy here, is to start just by, you'll see different inversions of a chord happening. So we're in C. So we could, let's, to Richard's point, let's thicken up the texture a little bit. Let's do a C6 chord. They were dealing with a C triad mostly in this piece, or the C7. The 6th chord is super common later on in stride. The 7th chord is actually more modern. In the 20s and 30s, it was more of a 6th chord than a 7th chord sound, which is interesting. So that perhaps felt a little bit more settled. That was a little bit more modern. So a preparatory exercise would just be to practice a bass note and a C6 chord. And feel free to try this with me. Now it's good, as Noah points out in a lot of his materials, to be fluent with different inversions of this chord. So we can do that inversion, that inversion, that inversion, and that back to root position. And we can, of course, thicken up the texture we like. We could be more octave based. So I'm literally just going to do, for now, a bass note and each inversion of a C6. Each one takes you a little bit further up the piano too, which is pretty cool. One quick body mapping or technique thing. I'm big into this thing called body mapping, which we haven't necessarily talked about on a live stream, but to make this a little bit easier for the hands, there's also a motion, there's a forearm rotation that happens that will help us to close the gap or close the distance here. So there's a little bit of a rotation to the thumb as we go through this. So rotate towards the thumb. So each of those chords, there's a little bit of a rotation, and that rotation can take us laterally across the piano. So that's the first step that I would take in mastering this just over one chord. The other thing you can do is start adding other notes of the chord on your second bass note. So root, root, root is fine. Also, root in fifth would be great. Talk and play that at the same time. That's the idea. We'll look at this as a progression in a moment, but that's getting us into that preparation for more advanced stride. Real quick before I pause here, the other thing that I would do is learn your right hand scales in octaves. And what helps me, again, is a little bit of a rotation to the thumb on those. There's something about a rotation to the thumb that allows me to play those a little bit faster. The second thing you can do that I would recommend is putting an interval in the middle. Probably a third would be best. So if we do that, we get a very, very, very sweet sound, because if we look at the interval composition, there's a third down here, and there's a sixth up here. Right? So you could literally put those two exercises together. I'm just going to stay with a C6 and a root. You could even go 1, 5 to some sort of G7 if you wanted to have a little bit more of a cadence. That's great too. Let's keep it super basic. All right? So we're really practicing a lot of things at once. If that's too much for you, break it down hand by hand. But those would be a way to extract some aspects of Scott Joplin's Proto Stride, as we might say. It's not necessarily totally stride. The other thing, of course, is learn the left-hand octave scales. You might even try what he does, which is putting a passing note in there. I'm going to put a passing note between G and A in the C scale. Right? For those of you familiar, that's actually a major bebop scale. So there are names for these things. You could really put the passing note anywhere. He put it between E and D. Wherever you want to put that. So those would be some great preparatory exercises. Scales and octaves, or with an interval. You have a third and a sixth. And some octave left-hand work. And learning those different inversions. That fluency with the inversions is key.